Hello, and welcome to another episode of Professional Book Girl. My name is Kayla, and I read a ton of books, but I recommend the best to you. And today is a very exciting book club episode because I am joined by the author of our January pick, Fiona Davis. Fiona, welcome to Professional Book Girl.
Oh, thank you for picking it for January. I am really, really honored by that.
You are one of my favorite authors, not even just historical fiction, just full stop, period. One of my favorite authors. I know so many of my listeners love you. When people ask me where to start with historical fiction, you are my number one. Like I always say, Fiona Davis, like go for Fiona Davis right away. So it feels like kind of a full circle moment to have you on the show. So I really appreciate you being here today.
I am so excited. It's absolutely my pleasure.
And this is the book club episode, so we are going to be discussing spoilers. So if you have not yet read The Stolen Queen, come back. You have to read it because I was obsessed with it. It's amazing. But come back after. Like we'll root everything for you in this episode.
Yeah, because there are some major, major, major spoilers.
Oh, yeah. So can you just give us kind of the elevator pitch for The Stolen Queen?
Sure. So it takes place at the Met Museum in New York City. It's 1978. And it's from the point of view of a very serious and enigmatic associate curator in the Egyptian wing named Charlotte. And because of certain circumstances, she has to unwillingly team up with this 19-year-old, wide-eyed, eager assistant to the Met Gala. And so we're talking about two very different departments here, the Egyptian art collection and then the Met Gala. I like to say it's glamour and mummies. And so this unlikely pair team up to try and track down a stolen artifact. And yeah, it's about, long held secrets and deadly curses, mothers and daughters. It covers a lot of ground.
Let's go backwards a little bit. So all of your novels each center around an iconic New York building. How did this idea come about in your writing?
Yeah, it was kind of organic. I had the idea to write the first book, which is set at the Barbizon Hotel for Women, when I was looking for an apartment and I saw a condo there. And I knew its history, that it had been this, storied hotel for people like Grace Kelly and Joan Didion. And I thought at the time I was a journalist, and I thought it would be a very good article to write about how it's changed over time. But some of the sources just wouldn't be interviewed, and I couldn't shake it. And I started thinking this would be a great book. And then I wrote that book. And suddenly it got published. It was, quite a shock. And then I was just walking around New York, where I've lived for 35 years now, and I passed the Dakota. And I thought, I would love to get in there, and maybe as an author, I can get some access. And so that's where it started. It was really just me wanting to find out about these ghosts that haunt these buildings and the generations of people who have lived there, and do a deep dive and be nosy.
As a native New Yorker, I feel like your books really add magic to the city. When I'm walking, like the Dakota specifically, I didn't really know what that was. And I was like, oh, when I enter Central Park from right by the Dakota a lot. And I was like, oh my God, like I was looking at it in a different light. And next week I'm going to see the Radio City Christmas show. And I'm already like, oh, it's this spectacular. Like it just adds a magic. And I feel like it's like really, you're putting these landmarks that are on the map kind of back on the map in a very fresh and unique way.
Oh, I love hearing that. I really do. I'm the same way. I can't go through Grand Central Terminal without looking for that little dark spot in the corner that shows how dirty the roof was back in the 70s before it was renovated. And just to see how these buildings have changed over time and how the people who go through these buildings have changed over time, I find a really fascinating job.
It's like, I feel like your novels kind of make me feel connected to the ghosts of New York history, kind of like the past, as I'm walking through Grand Central, because I'm from Long Island and my trains now go to Grand Central. So I like exit into there and I'm like, oh my God. And I have a Gossip Girl moment. And then I'm thinking about your book, and that was the first time I learned about what Grand Central was like. But so how did you come to the Met? Because I remember when you announced the next novel was the Met, I freaked out. It is my favorite museum in the world so far. It's so iconic. I think people know it in so many different lights. So how did that come to you?
Yeah, I wasn't sure where to set it. And to be honest, the Met is a very intimidating building. It's enormous. There's a lot going on. But I read this article in the New York Times about the 2018 Met Gala. And it said that at that gala, Kim Kardashian was there, and she wore this glittering gold dress that was really beautiful. And she posed for a photo next to this glittering gold sarcophagus. And the photo went viral. And it turned out the Met had just bought that sarcophagus the year before for $4 million. And when the photo went viral, the guy who had stolen the sarcophagus in Egypt complained to an undercover informant that he hadn't gotten paid. And this got to the Manhattan DA's office that has a whole unit that's about stolen art. And they started digging, and it turned out the papers were forged. And in the end, the Met had to give back the sarcophagus. And I thought it was such an interesting story of pop art and ancient history that I love that idea of melding two things that don't seem like they go together. And this seemed like it had it all. And so the book does deal with art repatriation, but I'm afraid Kim Kardashian is not in it because it takes place in 1978 and the 1930s.
Like I just felt like the Met was such a character in this book, the way that you described walking through in the art. And actually my favorite painting in the Met, the painting of Joan of Arc, like as a peasant girl, I've never seen that mentioned literally anywhere. I'm like I'm obsessed with it. I recently brought my mom to come see it. I always just stop, and I'm obsessed with the halos on the angels in the background. And when I saw it in this book, I freaked out. I feel like you just did an amazing job of bringing the Met to life, and it felt like actually walking through the museum. So what was the research like for the Met? Were you going there all the time?
I was going there all the time. I researched a lot of people who worked there, from docents to security guards to curators to staffers at the Met Gala. I got a wonderful tour. So I got down to the staff caf, which is what they call the cafeteria that's in the basement,
Oh, wow.
the storage areas. It's a remarkable building. And there's so many rooms, I think, that people don't know about, like musical instruments and all of these places. So it was fun to set the book at different places that you might not be as familiar with as, say, the Egyptian area.
Mhm.
So it was really doing that, doing a lot of reading about archaeologists in the 1930s, especially women archaeologists, and just stuffing my head with everything I could to do with the Met. And that was a lot.
Was there anything really interesting you learned in that process that didn't make it into the book?
Um, oh, that's a good question. There was so much. Like there was this interesting article from like the 1920s, I think, in the Met, where a guy was in the basement and he was doing something and it blew up and he died.
Oh.
And I was like, whoa, because you're kind of looking for things that are surprising when you're doing your research. Because I know if I'm surprised, it'll surprise the reader.
Mhm.
And then just learning about a few of the thefts that happened were kind of fascinating. Like there was one where, and this is similar to what happens in the book, where someone plucked the head off of a statue, basically, and walked out with it. And this
Oh,
was
wow.
before they had video cameras. This was, before so he could do it. And they eventually found it because I think he gave it to his girlfriend as a Valentine's Day present.
Oh my God.
And she said, no, absolutely not. And so then he hid it in a locker in Grand Central when they had lockers there. And the police eventually were told about it and went and picked it up. So it all worked out okay. But there are all these weird, funny little things that would be great in the book, but I couldn't quite work them in.
Yeah, I feel like you didn't even need to include the Met Gala. I mean, it made so much sense why you did because the necklace being on display, but the book itself, there's so much going on here, and I loved the fashion element. I went to FIT. I used to work in fashion history specifically is like my favorite, and so I love seeing Diana Virulin and just like the setup for the Met and what it used to be, because even when I was in high school 15 years ago, I was obsessed with the Met Gala and literally nobody knew what it was because it's like very recent that it's become this giant thing. So what was writing about the gala like and getting in Diana's head? Because she is such an interesting person.
I love that you're familiar with her because she really is someone who needs to be in the zeitgeist.
Yes.
I don't want her to fade from history. It was so much fun. I watched documentaries about her and read everything she wrote. And she was just a unique woman. She was very original. She said what she thought. She was in fashion, but she was very interesting looking. She
Mhm.
would rouge her lips and her earlobes, and she had this black lacquered hair and, this in skinny body that was always kind of in an S shape. And she had this wonderful voice. And yeah, I had no idea about the Met Gala other than the modern part. And so to learn that it started in 49 as kind of a luncheon in a hotel, and that tickets then were $50, and
Oh my
today
God.
they're $75,000.
Wow.
I know, I know. And that was a special time because in the 70s, that's when Deanna Vreeland was really changing it from being this boring lunch into this, huge gala at the Temple of Dender where Bianca Jagger and Mick Jagger and Diana Ross and all the cool people came. And of course, that's what it is today.
I love the little tidbit of because the security guard becomes a character in the book about having to tell Mick Jagger that he can't smoke in the bathroom or something like that. It's just so many fun little pop culture things happening. And then like there's just when I wrote my like really quick review, I was like, this book has literally everything, like everything you could want in a book, because we haven't even gotten into the Egypt of it all. But how did the idea tying it to Egypt, I'm assuming everyone listening has read it, but the Met acquires a necklace, and then Deanna and our character Annie, who I loved, decided to display it in the costume exhibit at the gala, and that is kind of what sets Charlotte down this path. So how did the idea of the necklace come about?
Yeah, I knew I wanted to set it in the Egyptian wing. I knew that that would be a great place to mine it. And as I was looking around and just looking at the exhibits, I found this beautiful broad collar, which is what the elite and royalty wore in Egypt, and it was just gorgeous. And I thought that's such a wonderful piece. I need to feature it in some way. And so by Charlotte finding it in the 1930s, and then it suddenly resurfaces at the Met when it should have been lost. Just because her world at that point is very small and sheltered. She's really repressed a lot of what she's been through in order to make it through her life. And so seeing that broad collar just sets her off and sets her on a journey that she possibly doesn't want to go down, but in the end is rewarding.
So let's talk about Charlotte. When I realized we were going to get flashbacks to her time in Egypt, I loved that so much. I love a flashback. I love like dual timelines. And I thought it was so well done. And she was such a fascinating, interesting character because in the 1930s, I think she was the only woman archaeologist. And we learned that her family was not happy with what she was doing, and she falls in love and has this grand adventure. And unfortunately, it didn't go her way. But how did the character of Charlotte come about?
It is very much inspired by a real life woman named Christiane
Oh,
Desroches Noblecourt. And she was this French archaeologist, and she led the most amazing life. And a woman named Lynn Olson wrote a biography of her. And I read it and I thought, and there's so many women like her. There are other women archaeologists who did incredible things. And reading that book and finding details like when you slept on a cot, and you would put cups of water under the legs of the cot to stop the scorpions from climbing up. And it's that kind of
crazy.
detail that helps really anchor the book where it is. And so this woman was incredible. In real life, she in World War II helped save all of this artwork from being stolen by the Germans from the Louvre.
Wow.
And then she went to Egypt. She was very instrumental in getting things like the Temple of Dendor saved when they were going to build the Aswan Dam, which would then flood the whole Nile Valley.
Oh,
And
wow.
this book it's just a bunch of adventures. And I read that and thought, that's my Charlotte.
I love that. And so we do follow Charlotte to Egypt, and your books have always been set in New York. What was it like to venture outside of New York, but then specifically to Egypt? Like, what a place to go.
Yeah, once I realized that's where I had to set the book, I knew I had to go. And so my boyfriend and I, we traveled there a couple years ago.
Oh my God.
Oh, it was incredible. We spent a couple weeks in Cairo. We were in Cairo, and then we traveled up the Nile on a boat,
Oh my God.
and then went to the Valley of the Kings, and traveled all along. It was really really incredible. Our poor tour guide, because every time he got free, I'd kind of pull him into a corner and be like, okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? But it was an incredible trip just because everything is so old. It's some of these things are 5,000 years old, and
Wild.
to get in the van after you land, we landed at like 4:30 in the morning, and the van took us to the hotel, which was near the pyramids. And at one point, it turned a corner, and there were the pyramids,
Oh
and they
my
were big
God.
because the sun was rising, and it looked unreal, and you thought, that's it. Those are the actual pyramids. After reading about them for so long, it was amazing. It was really fun.
I've been getting a lot of TikTok served to me of people on those Nile River cruises. So for a little bit, I've been like, okay, Egypt has to make its way onto my list. But after reading this book, I was like, Egypt is on the list. I have to go there now.
Good, good. It's a great country and the people are really friendly. It's a terrific place to visit.
So what was it? Were you nervous to set your book outside of New York, or was it kind of a fun adventure?
It was freeing,
Oh, I
to
love
be honest.
that.
Yeah, and also in this book, the flashback really only happens until about midway, and then the all the stories merge, and it continues forward as one story, and that was freeing too, because to pull those characters and those storylines together and let them take off was a lot of fun without having to go back and forth for the entire book. So yeah, the whole thing was really freeing just to explore, especially this setting in Egypt, which is almost like being on another planet, where there are days that the sand is covering the sun and everything's orange.
Oh
And
my
to
God.
try and describe something that's so different from New York in every way.
Do you think will we see this in future novels?
Sure, why not?
I love that.
It's fun to pull things. New York is my home, so that I think is my base. But yeah, I think there's so much to explore.
And I love that it was still so rooted in the Met. Because whenever I read one of your books, I'm like, the whatever the building is really like a character in it. But I was like, oh, it's not about New York at all. Like the Met still was like grounded throughout the whole story. So I feel like you just pulled it off so well. And as a fan of yours, it was so exciting to just see something different from you.
Oh, good, good. I'm glad. I will keep at it. That's excellent to hear.
So, are you now an Egyptologist? Because the amount of Egyptian history in this book, I feel like I almost could be. I learned so much from this book, which is my favorite thing about reading historical fiction.
Yeah, that's the thing is you want to learn, but you don't want to feel like you're being taught. You
Yep.
want to work through the character, and that's how you learn what it's like to be on a dig because the character's in a dig, or a tomb is starting to fall in, and how would you escape? That kind of thing's really fun to go along on the ride with. But yeah, in terms of being an actual Egyptologist, there's a woman named Colleen Darnell who is sort of my guru in all this. And she recently did an hour long Zoom talking about Hatshepsut, who is one of the female pharaoh in the book that is based on is her. And she did this 1 hour Zoom talk without looking at any notes. It was just,
Oh my God.
she has thousands of years of Egyptian history in her head. She can read hieroglyphics fluently.
Wow.
So there's so much she teaches, by the way. So you can take Zoom courses with her, and they're
Oh,
great.
cool.
But yeah, so there's so much to learn. I can't imagine being, that immersed in it. I could focus on Hatshepsut and what I needed to know, and the rest I just let go because otherwise I'd be overwhelmed.
So, let's get into that, like Charlotte's actual research. And, when in the 1930s, I loved how the guy didn't want to dig there. And she ends up having this major, major discovery.
That's what happened in real life to Christiane.
Oh
Real,
my
yeah,
God.
yep. It's a
Wow.
noble court. That's exactly what happened to her. And she
Oh
found
my.
found this whole tomb. It was great.
So how did that all come to be? And specifically, I'm gonna butcher the name Hatshepsut. You took inspiration from her to create kind of your own pharaoh. Let's tell me everything.
Yeah, so Hatshepsut was fascinating when I started learning about her because she was a rare female pharaoh. She took over when the actual pharaoh was just an infant. It was her stepson, and so she took over as regent. And she ruled really successfully for 20 years and did amazing things. There were such advances in architecture and medicine and they had economic prosperity. It was very peaceful. She did a great job. But then everyone forgot about her. And it was because a lot of her statues and images were hacked and broken and thrown into a quarry. And so no one
Wow.
really knew much about her. She wasn't thought of. She was kind of forgotten until the 1900s when they found the quarry filled with her broken pieces of her statues and started putting them together and realized this woman was really interesting because as time went along, her image became more male. So at first her statues have breasts and then as they go on, the breast gets smaller and she has like a false beard and a male headdress and starts wearing a kilt. And she
Wow.
really she takes over as pharaoh by in this way. Um, and then everyone thought that her statues were all hacked because this infant pharaoh, when he grew up, must have been really angry at her for usurping her, her his role, and that's why they were broken. And so even in the Met catalog from I think the 1950s, they describe her as a vain, ambitious, and unscrupulous woman. And then in the 60s, a scholar uncovers that all of this damage was all done much after she died, like 20 years after she died. And there were other reasons for it. And they had to do with the lineage and securing the next male pharaoh in line. That's what they think. And I just thought this was a fascinating story because here's a woman who was, revered and then forgotten and then reviled and then suddenly resurfaced and you understood she was again respected. And I thought that journey was fascinating, especially because Charlotte in the 1970s that was a time when women, until the mid 70s, women couldn't open a checking account or get a mortgage or get a loan without a man signing for them. And so those two women, I think Charlotte feels very strongly about Hathor, which is what she's called in the book because I had to change some things. She feels very aligned with her and wants to bring her true story to life.
There was so much in Charlotte's story, but even just Hathakari about, just being a woman in the world. And there's a moment when they're in Egypt and people are kind of, because they were single women, like people in Egypt didn't want to talk to them. And I think Charlotte mentions like when Hathakari was pharaoh, like women, it was just such a different time. And it just seemed like going backwards. And in today's political world, I was like a little like anxious reading that, but it just, I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. It was kind of just like the universal truth of being a woman in the world, kind of.
I think you're absolutely right. And it's about how these things go in cycles. And we think we're so far ahead of the game. But in fact, in Egypt, women could easily get a divorce. They could own property. If they got a divorce, they could keep the kids. They could keep a third of the property.
Wow.
There was sex before marriage was fine if you had a kid out of wedlock. What am I trying to say? If you had a kid out of wedlock, that was fine too. It was a very modern dynamic in many ways.
I love history, and I remember a few years ago I came across something that it was like progress isn't linear, and this just like really drove that home for me because I didn't know that like in Egyptian history that's what it was like, and then I loved learning that, but I was also like, all right, let's get back to it a little bit.
I know exactly. We moved beyond Trad wife. We've done that, yeah.
Yeah. But even with Charlotte's experience, her boss drove me crazy. Like I was so happy when she quit.
And keep in mind, these characters are fictional. It's not based the modern section. It's not based on anyone other than Deanna Vreeland, who has to be herself, of course, because she jumps off the page. But yeah, so it's not based on anything. But in the 70s, it was very hard for a woman to have a leading role in anything. And so, yeah, in the book, Charlotte does a lot of the work, but she doesn't get any of the glory, and her boss does.
So in your process with this book, what came first? Was it the Met or the Pharaoh?
The Met.
Okay.
Yes. Yep, the Met. And then I winnowed it down to, I knew the Met Gala had to be in it because that'd be fun. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to get to know that. And then I knew the Egyptian wing. And so then I had those two. And then it was just talking to docents and everybody I could about it's like a little city, the Met. There's so much going on, and trying to encompass the building and then figure out what I needed.
Okay, so interesting. We've talked about Annie very briefly, but I loved her. And I feel like you almost like this really could have just been Charlotte's story, but she added so much. I loved watching her run around for Deanna. And in my mind, like she goes on to become like Anna Wintour in the future. And she's now running the Met Gala. And it is what it is today. But her relationship with her mom specifically was very interesting to me. So why include all of that? And kind of how did Annie's character come to be?
Yeah, I wanted Annie to have a real journey. And so at the beginning, she's very codependent in dealing with her mother, who is very needy and can't really function without her daughter. And so it's almost like a reversed relationship where Annie has to take care of her mom. And she gets this opportunity to work at the Met and break away from that. And I wanted to just show how far she goes once she gets out of that mindset of, well, I have no boundaries. I have to take care of everybody. And she suddenly has a real job and has to please Deanna Vreeland, who is a really difficult woman to please. She was
Oh
a
yeah.
perfectionist. Um, and so, in a way, her life just gets blown wide open. And then disaster strikes when the Met Gala goes terribly wrong. And so suddenly she's on her own for the first time. She can't rely on her mom. She can't rely on Deanna Vreeland. She has no woman mentor, but then she switches over to Charlotte. And so it's really about her finding herself through these women and picking what she can from them in order to strengthen her own character and see who she is, to figure out who she is, because she's only
Mhm.
19.
I loved how Charlotte and Annie kind of they didn't rely on each other, but I feel like they really pushed each other kind of outside of their bounds and helped them grow so much. And when it was actually Charlotte's actual daughter asked Annie if she was that was her mom, and she just played along with it. I thought it was like it broke my heart a little bit, but I loved when she showed up on the plane in Egypt. I was like, yes, girl. Like I loved watching her journey with all of that.
Yeah, they were fun because at first they really don't like each other, and they're so
Mhm.
different. One's 60, one's 19. One was born, in I guess she'd be born in the teens, 19 something.
Yeah.
And, Annie's pretty modern. She's a modern girl. And so putting those together like oil and water was such a blast. And I wanted to explore that dynamic as well as mothers and daughters, because in a way they also have a mother-daughter relationship.
Yeah. So you mentioned like the Met Gala going horribly wrong. That scene of Deanna like says she wants butterflies, and I was impressed by how Annie managed to get butterflies, and then it's actually someone switches it and it's moths, and that I could just picture them. Like I was in my head, I was picturing like the last Met exhibit, where they had like these Worth gowns that couldn't even be stood up,
Yes.
like and moths just attaching them. It was so vivid in my imagination. How did that particular scene come to be?
Well, as I did the research, I learned that Deanna Vreeland always had perfume pumped into the room. She would have it infused into the room, and the perfume had to match whatever the exhibit was, which was really fascinating to me because I thought, God, that can't be good for the clothes.
Yeah.
But I don't, maybe it was just enough to smell it and not to damage them. And so I thought, well, I need this gala to go really wrong. This is kind of midway through the book. This is a huge turning point, and what's the worst thing that can happen to an exhibition of clothes? And I thought, oh, moths. And so it came from that because I could imagine Deanna Vreeland saying, I need butterflies, right? You can just picture that,
Oh, that made sense to me when she said that.
right? And so it all kind of fell into place. And I was so excited to write that scene. I couldn't wait.
So I'm like hopping over a little bit here, but back to Charlotte. There's this theme of her of aging and kind of like it's not too late to achieve your dreams. And that resonated with me. I actually do some work with this online platform for retired women, and so it's kind of like in my head all of the time. But I loved that she returned to Egypt after so much time, and that I feel like I might be making this up, but at one point she was like, I'm 60. And then later it was like, oh, I'm 60, like in such a different light. And I always say, like, I don't believe there's a best time of your life. Like, I feel like it should all be the best time of your life. And that, or Charlotte's journey with that, I loved reading it. How did that come to be?
Yeah, for me, I didn't start writing books until I was 45, and my
Wow.
first book was published when I was 49. And
Wow.
yeah, and I always thought, well, you have to be young to be a writer and start in your 20s. And so, but I wouldn't have had anything to write about because I hadn't lived life if I
Hmm.
tried to write a book in my 20s. And so I always stress that at book talks that, I'm in my 50s and, keep on changing careers until you find one that you really love because it's definitely worth it. And yeah, for Charlotte, I love that idea that you can say, okay, I'm 60 and my life is pretty, the majority of my life is over. And so I give up. But then I had a friend who was thinking about going to law school, and she was in her 50s. And she said, but when I graduate, I'll be 57. And I said, yeah, but, so what? Right?
Yeah.
If you don't do it, you won't have anything. And she went ahead and did it. And it just occurred to me. And also you think, you think of yourself currently and you're like, oh, I'm getting old. I have gray hair. I have whatever. And And then you think, well, when I'm 80, I'm going to look back when I'm 50 and say,
Mhm.
you looked pretty good and you
Yeah.
should have enjoyed it. And so I always remind myself that because I think as women, we're often very much judged on what we look like. And to think about, okay, what's your 80-year old self going to say when she sees you right now? She'd be like, yeah, go girl, go out and
Yeah.
do it.
I just really love that, and I loved. I mean, there's a huge trauma about why Charlotte didn't want to return to Egypt. I'm so glad she overcame that. But so let's talk about her past. She goes to Egypt. She falls in love. She has a baby, and then it feels like everything got ripped away from her. Why did you decide to include that? And then specifically with the boat, I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Where did that idea came from? I knew, I wanted to have her life really ripped apart, which is awful. And, I feel very bad. But as a writer, you can't write a book about a happy family who gets happier. Like no one would read it.
Yeah.
And so I needed her to have something that happens to her that really throws her for a loop. And by losing her husband and her child, um, she's devastated. She can barely move forward. And so but that gives her something to uncover as she gets these hints that maybe her husband might be alive. The broad collar that she thought went down with the ship, that's still here. What does that mean? And trying to follow that puzzle and untangle those and to hope that possibly her daughter is alive, but not hope, because that would be, in a way, that would be awful, to have missed her entire life.
Yeah.
And so there, she wins and she loses. I wanted this to be about women's relationship with women, and
Mm.
so mothers, daughters, older woman, younger woman, and so that mother daughter link, I very much wanted to explore and see if I could pull it off. Mainly because I don't have kids, and so that was a challenge to see if I could. How deep can you go and make it feel like it's an actual bond?
I First of all, I didn't even think the husband was going to be alive. Like I was like, there's no way he's been out there. And then when he was alive, I was like, okay, I see it. And the fact that her daughter was alive, like I wanted to like throw the book across the room because I was in a good way because I was just in shock and disbelief. And that whole scene when they're reunited, I thought was so beautiful. And when they discover they have the same streak of gray in their hair, like I just loved it. I had tears in my eyes as I was reading it. Did you always know that they both were going to be alive the whole time?
I'll be totally honest with you. I had the baby die in an early draft.
Oh wow.
Yeah, because I wanted her to survive in spite of.
Mm.
And then my editor read it, and she was really sweet with me. She said, I just want you to consider to have her live. And I thought, the more at first I said, oh no, that's the book's about this woman surviving terrible things. And but the more I thought about it, the more I thought, oh, that's even better. Like that's absolutely what should happen. And that's why having a good editor is key, because she could see it early on and see that I was heading off in a funny direction and right the ship. And so then it became a really fun thing of, okay, how do I make her live? How do I, the gray stripe, how do I connect them? How do I plant
Mhm.
those clues so that at the end you read it and go, oh, right, that's who that was. And so it all
You
makes
did it
sense.
so well.
Thank you. That was fun. It was a challenge, but it was well worth it. When I wrote that reunification scene, that was really satisfying. It was a great way to finish that manuscript.
And as I was reading it, I was like, I don't know if it could have happened in the same way in a modern novel, but because in 1930s is when this baby was discovered, like it made so much sense that she actually was alive the whole time.
Yeah, yeah, because there was no easy way to track anyone down. In Egypt, telephones didn't really work well back then.
Mhm.
So there was no, where we take so much for granted now because so much is documented. But back then, if you wanted to find someone in another country, forget it.
Yeah.
It would be pretty much impossible.
So then with her husband, in the beginning I thought their love story was so cute, and then we kind of see him get up to some nefarious actions. He kind of becomes a smuggler, and then we do learn that he did try to reach out to her, but like he was alive this whole time. Started a new family, which comes into play in a very big way. How did his journey come to be?
Yeah, I wanted him to be absolutely likable. I wanted them to feel like they could be together. And the reason why he starts to steal art and artifacts is because he wants to support his family. And he's really scared that he can't, because he comes from a lower class. He's well educated, but he's a scrappy guy, and he wants to make sure his family's going to be okay. So he does it for really good reasons.
Mhm.
He just falls in with the wrong friend. And yeah, and I like the idea that her parents kept them apart. That they were so shocked by what she did, which was absolutely in the 1930s not done. You did not, I mean, she was basically pregnant and then got married and all in a foreign country. They had no idea. And so when she comes back to America, they just want to shut that whole thing down. They don't want her to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. And so when he reaches out to her parents, they think they're protecting her.
Yeah, and that also seems so realistic to me. I was like, I'm sure that has happened so many times in history. But it broke my heart for her, especially then we do learn that she had been engaged when she was younger. And when she told her fiance the truth, he broke off the engagement. And then with her in the 70s with her boyfriend, he kind of acts weirdly when she tells the truth. Why did you decide to how did that come to be with like I'm sure that is a realistic reaction though that these men would have, but why include that?
I think the first one, I think it's understandable because it's the 1940s at that point, and there are just rules for things in that kind of high
Mm-hmm.
society, and where her fiance comes from, what she did was really unacceptable and sordid, and a scandal. And then later in the 70s, I feel like her boyfriend in the 70s is understanding as much as he can, but she doesn't let him in because she's been so scarred.
Mm-hmm.
She can't open up fully. And he always says, I feel like you're keeping secrets from me. You don't tell me everything. And it's true. So they're both at fault in a way. But I wanted to make him sympathetic in the way that he wants to be there for her. It's her resistance that causes the problem.
Yeah. Another major theme in this book, we kind of mentioned it earlier, is reparation. And I thought it was so interesting how Charlotte's opinion on it changed. So in the beginning of the book, she thinks that the artifacts are better off at the Met because the Egyptian museum is very underfunded and kind of just seems like a little bit of a mess. And she's like, we're housing them and protecting them. But then Annie makes a point like so many artifacts are just in the basement at the Met. And Charlotte kind of has a complete 180 with her opinion. How did that come to be? And what was it like to write about something like that? Because it is such a huge, timely topic even today.
Yeah, I mean, the Met has, I wrote it down, 1.5 million objects in its collection, and only 6% are on display at any one
Oh
time.
my God.
No, it's mind-boggling. But they can't. They've been around for over 100 years. This is what they do: is they go out and find these beautiful pieces, as do the British Museum and museums around the world. That was
Mhm.
just the way it was done. And only in the kind of the 70s did they start questioning, where do these things belong, and especially things that were looted and stolen. That's not fair.
Yeah.
Not fair that these institutions have them, and the countries where they came from and where they're truly revered don't have them. And so there's been a lot of talk of it lately. There's a lot going on. Every museum is reassessing its collection. It's not just the Met, it's the British Museum, it's all of them. And things like the Benin bronzes, which are these beautiful artifacts from Africa and what's now modern Nigeria, they were violently ripped away from the country, and now things are being done to get them back. And they're you can see both sides, where yes, they should go back to the country of origin. That's where they came from. That's where they belong. And then others say, well, what if the museums, the humidity will damage it? What if they get damaged? What if the country decides they need money and they sell it off to some oligarch who then puts it in his castle,
Mm.
and it's lost from the world?
Yeah.
And so it's an ongoing question that everyone is dealing with. And in the book, I think I mentioned that, Charlotte mentions the Benin bronzes, and she says, "Oh, they'll figure that out very soon." And that's in the 70s, which is what they thought, and it's still going on today.
They also mentioned, so I was just in Paris last month, and in the Place de la Concorde, there's this obelisk, and I did this like motorcycle sidecar tour, and my guide was so great, and he like I knew so much of the history he was telling me anyway, so we were having like fun banter about everything, and we had a whole conversation about how it came to be there. And he was like he's like the French government kind of just like ignores it, like they don't want to give it back. And it was mentioned in the book. I was like, oh, I was just standing right there having this exact conversation.
Yeah, and in Egypt at that time, it was something called partage, where any country that came in to do the digs, because they had the money to be able to really do these major excavations, they would give half of what they found to the Egyptian government. So it was a system
Mhm.
that they didn't steal it; it was agreed on. And so that's how a lot of that happened. So yeah, the obelisk, I think there's supposed to be two of them at this temple that Hatshepsut had put up, and one of them is now in France. So it's a little bit lopsided. And again, those are really big questions. But partage stopped, I think, in the sometime in the 1900s. That system stopped, and Egypt took full hold.
You also mentioned Howard Carter in the book, and I have read, I think it's called The Collector's Daughter by Jill Paul, about kind of all of his work. But a few years ago, I went to Highclere Castle, and that's where, like, it's insane because I'm like, oh, I'm at Downton Abbey. And then you go in the basement and there's a sarcophagus and there's a whole little museum. But when I was in there, I felt like bad mojo. I was like, I feel like this shouldn't be here. And I was like, I have to get out of here. I was like, I feel like bad vibes are going to get like attached to me. And I was getting very woo woo, and I'm not usually like that. But that was so interesting to me that they were able to just go in. And then this is now in literally Downton Abbey in the middle of England.
Yeah, and which we know so well. We feel like we've all lived there because of the
Yeah.
series. Yeah, and that's true. That the Earl at the time was the one who funded Carter's discovery of King Tut, and in fact, and died very soon after, which gave the whole thing that maybe there was a curse associated with
Mm.
it.
So, and in this book, there is a curse. Did you make that up, or was there one surrounded around the true pharaoh?
No, I made it up. I'm afraid. But it's ancient Egypt. I wanted some kind of magical realism to
Mm.
come in there, a little fantasy.
It made so much sense to me because I like viscerally remember how I felt in the basement of Highclere
That's
Castle.
so
So I was like,
interesting.
there's a curse. There's a
I'll
curse
check it
here.
out. That is so interesting. It's like all the pieces are saying, "Send me home." Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Have you been there?
No, no, I
Oh, you
haven't.
have to
But
go.
now,
You have to
I
go.
yes, I do.
Especially if you've seen the show. It's like it's bizarre. It's really weird being in there, but it's such a beautiful building.
You just hear the theme music in your head as you're walking around, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, and I took a taxi up from the train station, and my guide was like he was driving crazy on these roads, and I'm like, I've seen this happen on the show. I know, like, because it feels like you're in the show. It's like it's so wild. So what do you hope that readers take away from this book?
Yeah, I think all my books kind of deal with how women's voices and agency have changed over time and then how they haven't. I like the idea that when you look at the Met, you're not looking at a collection of art, but you're looking at a collection of stories.
Mm.
And you dig deep and see the story behind each item, because there is. It's just like New York through the ages. People have worn these things or hung them on their walls, and who inspired the painting, there's a beautiful book if you want to kind of get inside the Met called All the Beauty in the World by a guy named Patrick Bringley. And it's a beautiful memoir about him working as a security guard. He gave me a wonderful tour.
Oh,
Yeah, and it's a beautiful, beautiful book about looking at the art in a different way. So I highly recommend that. And then in the end, I think it's about reclaiming women's roles in history. And women like Christiane Desrochers Noblecourt, that these
mm.
women who have done so much. And in my author's note, I always try and push, here's where the real resources are, and go check them out. Here's what I made up. And so you can enjoy the book and then go down the same rabbit holes I did.
What was the title of the book about her?
It's called Queen of the hold on, I have it here. Empress of the Nile.
Okay, I have to read that.
Yeah, Empress of the Nile by Lynn Olson. It's great. You will love it. You will love it.
I'm like, I think that's my next audiobook. I can't wait. So I always on my podcast I talk about something that I'm currently obsessed with. It could be a book, a show, anything. I'm currently obsessed with Wicked. I'm actually seeing it tonight for the third time, which is maybe a little embarrassing. Is there anything that you're currently obsessed with?
Yeah, if you're in New York and you're looking for a show to see, there's a show called Eureka Day, and
Oh,
it
okay.
hasn't even opened yet. I saw it in previews. It is hilarious. It's moving. It's a great, 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 great show. It's about a group of parents and a school, and it's about vaccinations.
Oh,
Which
interesting.
sound, yeah, but I have to say, there is one scene in it where the entire audience was rolling in the aisles. I have not laughed that hard in a theater ever. I
Oh,
was
wow.
crying. And so I really highly recommend it. It's a Manhattan Theater Club production, Eureka Day, at the Sam Friedman Theater.
Okay, I'll definitely have to add that to my list.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can tease about what's next for you? I know we kind of did tease that maybe you'll be branching outside of New York, but is there anything you can say?
You know what, to be honest, there is a building that I have been wanting to feature for a really long time. I first learned of it over 10 years ago. So it will be in New York. It's the oldest
Oh.
house in New York. It's this beautiful, huge mansion. I have a picture of it on my bulletin board, so I'm staring at it. It's got these huge columns. It's an enormous white mansion. It's surrounded by these beautiful gardens. That's up on 161st Street,
Oh, wow.
and it has a credible history. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington headquartered there. The woman who lived there, who in the 1800s, Eliza Jumel, started as the daughter of a prostitute in Rhode Island
Oh,
and
wow.
moved to New York, and through her business acumen became the richest woman in New York.
Oh my God.
And her second husband was Aaron Burr from
Oh,
Hamilton.
okay.
And in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote parts of Hamilton in this house because he wanted to channel Aaron Burr.
Oh my God. Okay. I cannot wait.
It's great because it's this little museum that no one knows about, and I feel like people should. And I just thought, here's a way of maybe getting readers to go and explore it. And it has such a great history. I want to support it as much as I can.
Yeah, I have never heard of it, but I will be going to that museum now.
It's called the Morris Jumel Mansion.
Okay, amazing. Well, thank you so much. I have loved chatting with you, learning more about the book, diving deep into it. I just a dream to chat with you anytime, but specifically this book. I loved it so much.
Thank you so much. You made my day, and this was so much fun. This is the first time I've been able to talk spoilers, so this has been a real treat. So thank you. It was a real gift.
Oh, of course.